this is John for MTGO Nexus coming at you with another deck overview, this time with Blue-Red or Jeskai Grinding Breach Station in the modern format. As a friendly reminder, if you do like these modern deck overviews, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, leaving a constructive comment down below. And I'm going to say this as a proviso before I do this one. This is one of the few decks in the modern format that I have never had the opportunity to play. So most of what the information I'm gleaning from is from different articles written across different formats, such as Channel Fireball, TCG Player, etc., and across a lot of video coverage by mainly Corie Baumeister in his lead up and run up to the SCG event in Columbus a couple weeks ago, right before Dominaria United released. So most of these are not my opinions, they're what I've observed from watching these matchups. So keep that in mind, as I am not an expert of this deck, I'm just giving you an overview of what this deck does. So Grinding Breach Grinding Breach is a combination of the cards Grinding Station and Underworld Breach. This is a 2-card combo that you pair with some of these 0-mana artifacts to try to mill out your entire library. Cast a Thassa's Oracle with the aid of Mox Amber and some amount of legends, and kind of winning from there. Pairing with that, you also have things like Ragavan and Ledger Shredder to kind of give you a early Murktide beatdown game-esque plan, forcing your opponent to answer with these. And you also get to pair it with Urza's Saga, so you kind of get this like 3 different angles of attack that your opponent has to respect. You can win with the Ledger Shredder, Ragavan beats. You can win with the Urza's Saga construct, artifact plan. Then you kind of have this like grindy plan with Emery, Lurker of the lock, and also Underworld Breach in a pinch can also supplement a grinding game plan, set you up with a bunch of cards with recurring some Mishra's Baubles, kind of get you a new hand that way and give you a chance to reload if your opponent happened to answer your first wave of things. You also get to play one of the most broken cantrips in the Magic ethos, and that is Expressive Iteration, as you are a blue-red deck in the modern format. And you also are leveraging a very mana-efficient deck in order to be able to do that. Beyond that, you have some Teferi Time Ravelers in your main deck to keep your opponent from being able to interact with you during your key combo turn, yet another card that your opponent has to fight through in your myriad of threats. As far as how the combo works, Grinding Station itself mills 3 cards when you sacrifice an artifact, and then Underworld Breach allows you to escape cards if you happen to have 3 cards available to do so. This is kind of like a perfect case scenario where your 0-mana artifacts allow you to mill 3 cards with Grinding Station on taps. You then get to continue this process with Underworld Breach. Why Mox Amber is important is it provides you with the mana unable to be able to cast your winning spells. Your winning line, once you kind of mill things out, are either Thassa's Oracle. Obviously, if you've exiled your entire library by milling it with a 0-mana artifact, you get to win the game on the spot. And then Lightning Bolting your opponent to death if you happen to have, say, enough mana to cast 3 or 4 Lightning Bolts after you've gotten some chip shots in with Ledger Shredders and Ragavans. And obviously, you have there's a Saga plan, which, making constructs when you're playing a deck with some cheap artifacts, not that hard to do, although they aren't always the biggest ones, especially in the pre-board games, as you don't really have a lot of bullets for the Urza's Saga itself. Beyond that, you're only really touching on white for Teferi and Prismatic Ending out of the sideboard, but it still is a very important thing to have access to, as Prismatic Ending allows you to answer a lot of the permanent-based hate cards your opponent might have, and then Teferi obviously, kind of keeping your opponent's counterspells and interaction at bay during your turn. Like I said, this deck is very powerful in terms of what it's capable of doing. It has multiple angles of attack, but by opening itself up to multiple angles of attack, it's also open to a bunch of different great hate cards. It's very vulnerable to things that hit 0-mana spells, as your Mishra's Baubles and Mox Amers are quite important. So, the stuff that hits Cascade, like Chalice and Void Mirror, etc., can be quite problematic, as well as Lavinia. It's also open to graveyard-based hate, as a lot of its combo and Emery itself, really get value from the graveyard, so it's vulnerable to things like Endurance, Leyline in the Void, Rest in Peace, etc. And also, you don't run a ton of threats in the deck, and while you do run Ledger Shredders, Ragavans, and Emerys, and your opponent really has to respect and answer all of those, creature removal is quite prevalent in the modern format, especially with Leyline of Binding starting to pop up everywhere. It's really kind of a catch-all answer to almost everything in your deck. The thing the deck does provide, it's a very powerful, very quick deck to win. It can win off the back of a creature beatdown plan, it can win off the back of construct tokens and value from Urza Saga, and it can win off of this just 2-card combo that can kill your opponent on turn 2 or turn 3 out of nowhere. So it kind of trades off some of its weaknesses by being this very powerful, very quick to win deck, and still having some long game with Underworld Breach, Expressive Iteration, and Emery. The weaknesses of the deck, as I've already said, it gets hit by a myriad of different angles of attack, and it's a very tricky to play. Learning the sequencing decks, much akin to Resist as Shadow, you kind of have to have some iteration with the deck before you're able to play the deck at its highest point. As far as the sideboard, we've already kind of touched on Teferi and Prismatic Ending being able to answer a lot of the permanent-based hate cards you're going to see. Spell Pierce a little bit to protect your combo or creatures. Ether Gust for things like Primeval Titan and such, or Omnath and that kind of pile. Mystical Dispute for any type of counterspell-based deck, especially the Murktide matchup, the Izzet Creativity matchup, etc. Wear Terror when you need to have more answers to your opponent's hate cards besides Prismatic Ending. Engineering Explosives, quite important in other quick-based matchups like Burn and Hammer Time. Shadow Spear important when you're going to be in racing situations, especially against aggressive decks like Burn. Pithing Needle when you need to shut down annoying permanents your opponents might have. And then Tormod's Crypts for any type of graveyard-based deck such as Living End, and can also help some in the Murktide matchup. Recent innovations from the deck, including replacing Ledger Shredder, or using Ledger Shredder to replace Dragon Rage's Channeler. Now this does decrease the mana efficiency of the deck, but does give you a potential game-winning threat, whereas DRC really chips in for 3 damage, but isn't very good blocker, especially once you turn on Delirium. And, let's kind of slow down the deck a tiny bit by giving you a little bit more resilience and card selection in the mid to late game. This list is very much similar to what we just saw. In fact, other than another Prismatic Ending and not choosing to run Ether Gust, a lot of the options are still the same with this list. Most of these lists are largely based off of Ross Merriam and Corie Baumeister's finishes in the recent SCG events, and this deck really didn't pick up too many pieces from Dominaria United. As far as where the deck's placed in the meta, from what I've come to understand, it's quite positive against the mana-heavy decks. 4-color control is a tempo against creativity. It's reasonable against Hammer and reasonable against control, simply because of its mana efficiency and power, while also having a lot of answers to things like Hammer stuff coming up. It has reasonable matchups against Living End, Burn, and Crushing Footfalls. Like I said, I'm going off of an article I'm finding on TCG Player for this. And then its unfavored matchups, well, slightly unfavored matchups, are things like Golgari Yawgmoth, Amulet Titan, and Rakdos Scam. Basically decks that can set up quickly and disrupt your creature into things while also having disruption for your graveyard. Basically decks that are playing a lot of hand disruption for your early turns plus a bunch of pressure, or decks that can keep your creatures in check while also having their own combos to win the game quite quickly. One deck that would probably give it fits, and it's kind of mentioned, is no current modern decks are heavily unfavored. No, Eldrazi Tron doesn't count. I suspect Eldrazi Tron is difficult simply because of Chalice of the Void being such a heavy hitter against this deck, especially on 0 and 1 being quite relevant. And there really are no decks that main Bellward a bunch of Chalices, unlike maybe Blue-White Control in the current meta. As far as how the deck wins, we already talked about, they have the beatdown plan, they have the construct plan, and you also have the grinding station, just A plus B combo kind of kill you. In some ways, it harkens back to Splinter Twin combo, while being a little bit more, relevant again with hate against it, as the graveyard hate does kind of shut off the combo, and it kind of ebbs and flows as graveyard hate and such, pick up. One of the articles I read, it's kind of opened back up in the format a little bit because creativity being such a large presence forces especially 4-color control to kind of shift their sideboard cards to kind of fighting creativity, and this deck already has a reasonable creativity matchup because of its mana efficiency and ability to disrupt the creativity combo deck. Basically, the more graveyard-based hate that's around because of Living End, this deck tends to struggle a little bit more, so it kind of gets some splash damage when Living End is on upper part of the format. When Living End's kind of receded a little bit and creativity has kind of become the main combo deck of the format, this deck tends to fare a little bit better because obviously the targeted hate for creativity is a little bit different than the targeted hate for this deck. Overall, this is a very fast, somewhat resilient combo deck that has a fairly good grinding plan, especially game 1. It is a little bit vulnerable to graveyard hate, and can struggle in certain matchups. For instance, against a deck like Burn, while it is considered a even matchup, Burn does have a number of cards that give this deck fits. Eidolon the Rebel, Eidolon the Great Rebel. Rolling Vortex is another card that hits all these Mox Ambers and Mistress Baubles coming out of the thing. And it's also a deck that can fairly easily disrupt a lot of what's going on. While it's not a deck that typically runs hard graveyard hate anymore. It wouldn't take much to run a couple Rest in Pieces if this deck rose to places in the meta. So, this is one of those decks that the lower it's on the radar, the better it tends to function. So that way, it's a little bit of a glass cannon in terms of that. But, you still have the backup plan of Ragavan, Ledger Shredder, that kind of thing to close out the game. But, in Modern, it's kind of trivial for a deck to kill a bunch of creatures. So, overall, this is a very powerful deck that if you want to see a lot more coverage or a lot more in-depth things on the deck, I would recommend checking out Corie Baumeister's YouTube channel, as he has quite a bit of content on this. I think there's upwards of like 20 plus hours of this deck being played recently between backpack coverage of the SAG event in Columbus recently, and as well as some of his preparation for that event. But very powerful deck that has had some recently good performances going into Dominaria United Modern, and a deck that you should be aware of. Just figure I'd give you a quick overview of the deck, and hopefully you'll get a little bit better understanding of what the deck is capable of doing. As always, if you like this kind of modern deck overviews, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, and leaving a constructive comment down below.